तर अब क्षतिको बावजुद पनि यो इतिहासको पन्ना पल्टिसकेका छ। यसको लागि हामीहरू युवाहरू सबै जागिसकेका छौँ। त्यही भएर यस्तो कुरो भएछ संसारमा, संसार बदलिसकेका छ हामीहरूको लागि। अब गरी खान पाउँछ यो, जस्तो मलाई लाग्छ यो देशको स्थितिलाई। हामी यही दुई शब्द राख्न चाहन्छौँ। पानी तो हिलता है।
What if I told you that a political crisis in a small Himalayan nation could send tremors through the entire South Asian region and ripple all the way to global powerhouses? It sounds dramatic, right? But that's exactly what's happening in Nepal. This isn't just a story about one prime minister losing his seat or another protest in another capital. This is a story about youth power clashing with old politics, about digital freedom colliding with authoritarian impulses, and about how geography can turn a landlocked country into the epicenter of a regional storm. Nepal, famous for Mount Everest, stunning temples, and trekking adventures, is suddenly famous for something far more dangerous: a political earthquake. Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli is out. Parliament is in flames, literally. Young protesters are rewriting the country's future. And neighbors like India, China, and even Pakistan are nervously watching because they know that what happens in Nepal doesn't stay in Nepal. So buckle up, because in this video, we're unpacking 5 big reasons why Nepal's crisis matters, not just for South Asia, but for the entire world.
When you think of a rebellion, you might picture torches, pitchforks, and a Shakespearean king hiding behind a velvet curtain. But in Nepal's case, the revolution came not with farm tools, but with smartphones, hashtags, and more determination than the government ever expected. The so-called Gen Z rebellion is more than just a flashy name. It's a seismic shift in South Asia's political mood. Let's dive in. Nepal's latest political meltdown didn't start in parliament, nor did it begin in some smoke-filled back room where politicians were swapping ministries like trading cards. It ignited on the screens of a young generation who have grown up staring at the Himalayas on one side and corruption scandals on the other. The trigger? A government ban on social media platforms. Yes, the very apps that Gen Z breathes through like oxygen. Imagine telling a fish it's not allowed to touch water. That's essentially what Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli did when he blocked Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, and YouTube in a bid to control online dissent. Spoiler alert, it backfired. Badly. Tens of thousands of young people, already simmering with frustration, poured into the streets on September 8th. They weren't just angry about losing their memes and dance challenges, though, let's be honest, that didn't help. They were furious about years of corruption, nepotism, and being treated like extras in their own country's political drama. This wasn't a generation demanding cheaper Wi-Fi, it was a generation demanding accountability, jobs, and an end to the revolving door of leaders who seemed to care more about clinging to power than solving problems. And the state's response? Classic playbook stuff: barricades, tear gas, water cannons, and eventually live bullets. At least 19 protesters were killed in the first wave of clashes, sparking even more outrage. Within 48 hours, Oli was out of a job, and Nepal's parliament building was quite literally on fire. This was not just another protest, this was Gen Z saying, if you won't listen to us, we'll rewrite the script ourselves. Here's the kicker: Nepal's youth didn't appear out of nowhere with this rage. This is a country where unemployment among young people hovers around 20%, where migration abroad is practically a rite of passage, and where those who stay behind feel locked out of a political system dominated by the same few families and parties for decades. They've grown up hearing promises of reform, transparency, and modernization, only to watch leaders cash in favors like they're at an all you can eat buffet of corruption. So when Oli mocked the protesters as spoiled Gen Z kids who thought they could demand anything they wanted, he might as well have lit the match himself. If this sounds familiar, that's because it is. We've seen youth driven uprisings across the region: Sri Lanka in 2022, Bangladesh in 2024, and now Nepal in 2025. Each time, the recipe is the same: disillusioned youth, plus arrogant rulers, plus social media bans or censorship, equals a political volcano. The lesson: underestimate Gen Z at your own peril. These are not teenagers sulking in their rooms. These are digitally savvy, globally connected citizens who know how to organize, mobilize, and broadcast their anger to the world in real time. And here's why it matters globally: what starts in Kathmandu rarely stays there. Youth uprisings have this uncanny ability to ripple across borders. They inspire, they embolden, they terrify entrenched elites in neighboring countries who suddenly find themselves wondering if their own young populations are next. Remember, South Asia has one of the world's largest youth populations. If Nepal is the spark, the whole neighborhood is the tinderbox. So, fact one is simple but explosive. Nepal's Gen Z rebellion isn't just about kids with smartphones, it's about a generation refusing to be sidelined any longer. And when a country's youth decides enough is enough, history tells us that change, messy as it may be, is inevitable. But youth anger is only the beginning, because when Nepal sneezes, it's not just Kathmandu catching a cold, it's Delhi, Beijing, and Islamabad reaching for the tissues. Let's talk about the regional stability earthquake this crisis is triggering.
Here's the thing about Nepal: it's not just another landlocked country with postcard worthy mountains and monks in saffron robes. It's the Himalayan middle child caught between two heavyweight siblings, India and China, who are constantly trying to outmuscle each other at the dinner table. And, like every middle child, Nepal has mastered the art of playing both sides. Until now. Because when Kathmandu burns, the shockwaves don't politely stop at its borders, they rattle right through South Asia's security calculus. Let's set the scene. Nepal stretches roughly 885 kilometers east to west and just under 200 north to south. On the map, it looks small, almost squishable between the bulk of India and the reach of China. But geography is destiny. For centuries, Nepal has been the buffer zone, the hinge that stops New Delhi and Beijing from butting heads too directly. And now, in 2025, with Oli out, parliament in chaos, and protesters demanding a complete political reset, that balance has gone wobbly, like a Jenga tower one block away from disaster. First, India. Culturally, economically, linguistically, Nepal and India are cousins, if not siblings. Millions of Nepalis work in India, trade flows daily across their open border, and Bollywood has more influence in Kathmandu than half of Nepal's politicians combined. But it's not all hugs and nostalgia. India has long been accused of treating Nepal like its backyard, interfering in its politics, blocking supplies when governments tilt too far toward Beijing, and generally acting like the big brother who wants veto power over your life choices. With Oli gone, a man India wasn't particularly fond of, New Delhi smells an opportunity, a reset.
a chance to claw back influence. But that window comes with danger because nothing unites Nepalis faster than the suspicion that India is meddling in their sovereignty. Now, zoom north to China. Beijing has been steadily extending its shadow over Nepal with infrastructure projects, trade deals, and that sweet, sweet Belt and Road Initiative money. Oli, before his resignation, was widely seen as tilting toward Beijing, even at the cost of souring ties with India. For China, Nepal is not just a neighbor, it's a strategic outpost, a place to project influence south of the Himalayas, and, frankly, a convenient way to keep India guessing. Oli's fall? That's a headache for Beijing. It risks undoing years of careful courting. Cue frantic phone calls in Beijing's foreign ministry. And then the wild card, Pakistan. To be clear, Nepal Pakistan ties are not front page material. They're cordial, occasional, and strategically useful mainly as a reminder to India that Kathmandu has other friends. But still, Islamabad is watching closely because when protesters bring down a prime minister over corruption, authoritarianism, and sheer political arrogance, Pakistani elites can't help but see their own reflection in the mirror. Nervous much? You bet. What does this mean in the bigger South Asian picture? Instability in Nepal equals nervous neighbors. Borders suddenly matter more. Refugee flows are a real possibility if violence escalates. Trade disruptions spill into northern India, hitting states like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, where cross border commerce is woven into daily survival. Add to that the specter of both India and China trying to prop up their guy in Kathmandu, and you've got yourself a Himalayan tug of war that could get very messy very fast. Globally, too, Nepal's unrest resonates. The US and EU have interests in keeping the region stable, not because they're obsessed with Nepali politics, but because instability in South Asia is like throwing a rock into a pond. The ripples touch everything supply chains, security, and even climate cooperation, given Nepal's centrality in Himalayan water resources. So, why does Nepal's crisis matter? Because it's never just Nepal. It's India wondering if Beijing will move closer. It's China calculating how much influence it's losing. It's Pakistan nervously glancing at its own Gen Z. And it's the rest of the world realizing that one small country wedged between mountains has the power to tilt the regional chessboard. And if you think geopolitics is the only mess here, think again. Because when politics collapses, so does the economy. And Nepal's economic fallout? It doesn't stop at the Himalayas either. Let's talk money, survival, and why your next Himalayan vacation might be canceled. When politics burns, economies don't just sweat, they collapse in slow motion, like a Jenga tower pulled by amateurs. Nepal right now is not just facing an identity crisis, it's facing an economic migraine that could turn into a full on stroke if the chaos drags on. And here's the bad news. In an interconnected world, you don't need to live in Kathmandu to feel the pinch. Let's start at home. Nepal's economy was already fragile before this political blowout. With a GDP of around $40 billion, dollars, pocket change compared to its giant neighbors, Nepal relies heavily on a few lifelines remittances, tourism, and imports. And guess what? Every single one of those lifelines just got a chokehold. Take remittances first. Almost one in every three Nepali households depends on money sent home by workers abroad, whether from the Gulf, Malaysia, or India. These remittances make up nearly 25% of Nepal's GDP. That's right, one quarter of the economy is literally outsourced labor. But here's the kicker. Political instability back home doesn't just scare off investors, it also messes with banking, exchange rates, and trust in the government's ability to manage that inflow. Families that live month to month on money wired from abroad suddenly face delays, disruptions, and higher costs. When you shake the system, the people at the bottom pay first. Now add tourism. Ah, the famous image. Foreigners trekking through Annapurna, lining up for Everest base camp selfies, sipping tea with panoramic views of the Himalayas. Tourism is about 7% of Nepal's GDP and a crucial source of jobs. But what happens when international news shows your parliament building on fire, protesters storming the streets, and governments slapping travel advisories faster than you can say namaste? Bookings plummet, airlines reroute, tourists reschedule, and when they do come back, trust is shaken. Nepal's charm is mountains and mystique, not mayhem and martial law. And then there's imports. This is a landlocked country, meaning every drop of oil, every kilo of wheat, every box of medicine has to cross a border. When India sneezes, say with stricter checks at the border, Nepal catches pneumonia. With protests shutting down supply chains, roads blocked, and trade stalling, ordinary Nepalis face rising prices. Cooking gas, petrol, even basic groceries shoot up in cost. Inflation climbs. It's the average citizen who suddenly finds that their salary buys half the rice it used to. And good luck convincing people that democracy is working when they can't even afford dinner. The global ripple effect. Let's not pretend Nepal is the economic engine of Asia, but instability here still matters. First, it creates uncertainty in South Asia, where investors already factor in political risk like it's weather. If Nepal is unstable, it adds fuel to the narrative of a region plagued by volatility. That perception spooks capital. Second, Nepal sits on critical water resources, rivers flowing south into India and beyond. Instability affects water sharing treaties, hydropower projects, and regional cooperation on energy. And third, in a world hypersensitive to supply chain shocks, from chips in Taiwan to grain in Ukraine, no country wants yet another source of unpredictability, however small it looks on a map. And then let's talk migration. When economies collapse, people move. Thousands of Nepalis already migrate for work every year, but economic freefall at home could accelerate that exodus. Neighboring countries like India will feel the strain first. But migration patterns don't stop neatly at borders. They ripple outward, adding pressure on labor markets elsewhere. Here's the bitter irony. Nepal's economic troubles aren't new. They've been simmering for decades, often blamed on corruption, weak governance, and lack of long term planning. The protests didn't create the crisis, they just ripped the band aid off. And now the world is staring at an open wound that will take more than foreign aid or IMF loans to stitch up. So, what do we have? A country where remittances are shaky, tourism is bleeding, imports are strangled, and citizens are left to pay the price. That's not just a domestic headache, that's a regional migraine with global consequences. But wait, we've talked about protests, geopolitics, and the economy. The real drama is political power itself. Who takes charge when the old guard falls? And how does a youth uprising change the rules of the game? Let's talk power, governance, and the dangerous precedents this crisis is setting.
Here's the thing about South Asian politics leaders don't just leave, they get shoved, tripped, or occasionally bulldozed out of office. And in Nepal, KP Sharma Oli didn't simply step down because he felt like gardening in retirement. He was forced out by a cocktail of protests, cabinet defections, and good old fashioned public fury. But this isn't just about Oli's dramatic exit. It's about what comes next and why that sets a precedent that could echo across the region like a bad karaoke performance you can't unhear. Let's start with the obvious. Ali wasn't exactly a stranger to power. 4 terms as prime minister. 4! If Nepali politics were a Netflix series, he'd be the recurring villain who keeps coming back no matter how many times you think the hero finally got rid of him. But by the end, even his allies couldn't stomach his arrogance. When your cabinet members start resigning faster than contestants on a reality show, you know your days are numbered. The Gen Z movement that toppled Ali wasn't satisfied with just one scalp. They demanded Parliament's dissolution, fresh elections, an interim government they get to help pick, and prosecution for those responsible for firing on protesters. That's not a shopping list. That's a regime overhaul. And here's where the precedent kicks in. Because when young protesters can essentially dictate the political future, leaders in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, even India start sweating bullets. If Kathmandu's youth can bring down a prime minister in 48 hours, what's stopping others from trying the same script? Cue the interim government. Enter Sushila Karki, Nepal's first female prime minister, at least on an interim basis. A former chief justice, she's respected, relatively neutral, and, crucially, not tied to the endless merry-go-round of corrupt party politics. It's a bold move, but also a gamble. Can a non party figure steady the ship long enough to prepare for elections in 2026? Or will she just be a placeholder leader in a country where placeholders often become pawns for bigger players? Meanwhile, political parties in Nepal are in crisis mode. The communist factions, the Nepali Congress, all of them are scrambling to stay relevant in a landscape where the streets, not the parliaments, are calling the shots. The danger? Too much fragmentation, too little consensus. And history tells us what happens then. Stability becomes the norm. Remember, since 2008, Nepal has cycled through 14 governments. 14! That's more than some people go through smartphones in the same period. Stability has been the exception, not the rule. Globally, Nepal's crisis raises uncomfortable questions. If governments collapse under street pressure, does that strengthen democracy or weaken it? On one hand, you could argue this is democracy in action, the people taking power back from arrogant rulers. On the other hand, there's the risk of normalizing mob rule, where whoever can mobilize the loudest protests sets the political agenda. That's not sustainable governance, that's roulette with your constitution. Then there's the censorship angle. Ali's social media ban was supposed to strengthen his control. Instead, it blew up in his face, turning frustration into full-blown rebellion. Other governments from Southeast Asia to Africa are watching closely. The lesson? Clamp down too hard and you might just accelerate your own downfall. That's a precedent no authoritarian leader wants trending. And don't overlook the military. With curfews in place and troops on the streets, Nepal's army is suddenly center stage. If civilian leaders fail, the temptation for the military to expand its role grows. That's a slippery slope, and one that South Asia is all too familiar with. Pakistan, anyone? So, what do we have here? A fallen leader, a youth driven precedent, an interim prime minister, and a region full of nervous rulers wondering if they're next. Governance in Nepal is no longer just about who sits in Singha Darbar Palace. It's about whether the entire model of South Asian democracy is being rewritten by young, angry, smartphone wielding citizens. But politics isn't only about who sits in the chair, it's also about the ideals that drive nations forward or tear them apart. And Nepal's crisis? It's shaping not just its future, but the global conversation about democracy, digital rights, and the power of youth. Let's talk global ideals and why this Himalayan crisis is everyone's problem.
Here's the uncomfortable truth. Nepal is not a global superpower. It doesn't dictate oil prices, it doesn't control semiconductor supply chains, and it doesn't have nuclear weapons to make the world hold its breath. Yet somehow, when Nepal catches fire, people far beyond its borders sit up and pay attention. Why? Because it's not about size, it's about symbolism. Nepal's crisis is less a local story and more a preview of how the 21st century's battles over democracy, digital rights, and youth power will play out. Let's start with democracy. In theory, democracy is about elections, institutions, and rule of law. In practice, in much of South Asia, it's often about personalities, patronage, and who can keep their cronies fed. Nepal's Gen Z rebellion ripped that facade wide open. Young people were not just protesting against one man or one party, they were protesting against an entire system that had failed to deliver. The message is clear. Democracy without accountability is just theater, and the audience is done watching. That message isn't just for Kathmandu, it's for Colombo, Dhaka, Islamabad, and even Delhi. If Nepal proves anything, it's that South Asia's young populations will no longer politely clap at the performance, they'll storm the stage. Now, let's talk digital rights. Oli's decision to ban social media was supposed to silence dissent. Instead, it became the spark that lit the inferno. That irony will be studied in political science classrooms for decades. Governments worldwide, from authoritarian states to pretend democracies, are watching closely. Can you control the narrative by cutting off platforms, or does that guarantee that dissent explodes offline, where it's even harder to contain? In Nepal, the answer was clear: silence people online, and they'll make noise in the streets loud enough to topple a prime minister. That's not just a Nepali lesson, it's a global one. In the digital era, free speech isn't a luxury, it's a pressure valve. Block it, and you invite an explosion. Then there's the generational angle. South Asia is young, very young. Over half the region's population is under 30, and they're tired of waiting. They're tired of corruption scandals, nepotism, and governments that act like citizens should be grateful for breadcrumbs. Nepal's Gen Z protesters represent a wider trend, the youth bulge turning into a battering ram. The world should pay attention because this isn't confined to Asia. From climate protests in Europe to racial justice marches in the US, youth driven movements are rewriting the political script everywhere. Nepal is simply the latest and one of the loudest reminders that generational impatience is the new global currency of change. Global powers also see opportunity and risk. China fears losing influence in a country it thought it was leaning its way. India sees a chance to reassert its role, but risks overplaying its hand. Western governments talk about democracy and stability, but what they really fear is contagion. The idea that if Nepali youth can succeed, maybe others will try too. Suddenly, supporting youth led change looks inspiring in speeches, but terrifying in strategy rooms. And let's not forget climate and resources. Nepal is home to the Himalayas, the water towers of Asia. Instability here affects not just politics, but water sharing agreements, hydroelectric projects, and the livelihoods of millions downstream in India, Bangladesh, and beyond. Political chaos undermines the global fight against climate change. And trust me, melting glaciers don't wait for stable governments. So, here we are, a small Himalayan nation, often overlooked, suddenly becomes a prism through which the world sees its own challenges. Democracy under strain, digital repression backfiring, youth demanding not tomorrow, but now, and neighbors and global powers scrambling to adjust. Nepal's crisis matters not because it will reshape the global economy overnight, but because it symbolizes the kind of conflicts we'll see everywhere in the 21st century: citizens versus elites, free speech versus censorship, youth versus entrenched power. And in that sense, what's happening in Kathmandu is not just Nepal's story, it's everyone's story. So, 5 facts later, what do we have? A youth rebellion, a regional tug of war, a migraine economic, a political precedent, and global ideals under fire. Nepal's crisis isn't a footnote, it's a headline for South Asia and a warning for the world.
So there you have it, 5 hard-hitting reasons why Nepal's current crisis is not just a local headline, but a global wake-up call. From the Gen Z rebellion shaking entrenched politics, to India and China's tug-of-war, to the economic aftershocks and global lessons about democracy and digital rights, Nepal is suddenly everyone's business. Now here's the real question. What do you think? Is this youth-driven uprising a turning point for democracy in South Asia, or is it a dangerous precedent that risks turning street protests into political weapons? I'd love to hear your take, so drop a comment below and let's get the debate going. And hey, if you found this breakdown sharper than your morning coffee, hit that like button. It really helps the channel. Don't forget to subscribe to Global Pulse News for more high-energy, fact-packed deep dives into the stories shaping our world. And share this video with someone who still thinks Nepal is just about mountains and trekking, because trust me, the story here runs much deeper. Stay curious, stay informed, and as always, keep your pulse on the globe.